What's up, everyone? Welcome to another edition of Processing Blue, where, yes, we process blue for you. I'm Alex Zietlow. He is Mike Kaye, and we are reporters for the Charlotte Observer. We are both in Indianapolis right now for the NFL Scouting Combine. I am currently huddled in a corner in the Indiana Convention Center. Mike is just ahead of the game and in his hotel room ready for a wonderful night. But Mike, before we talk about, well, we're not going to talk about what we're getting into tonight. We're going to have a nice dinner, whatever. But we got to talk about a lot of things that happened today on Tuesday. Among them, you proved that you are right again. And Mike, I just want to give you the floor. How are you right this time around?
The Panthers are making a switch up with play calling. Dave Canales has handed over play calling to Brad Idzik, the offensive coordinator, who to this point was just an offensive coordinator in title. Well, guess what? Now he's calling plays. The bulk of the fan base probably got an inkling when we talked about it last week about Darrell Bevell coming in. It wasn't completely confirmed heading into the combine that Brad would take over play calling. I thought it was the logical move. It is the logical move. I've been really impressed by a lot of his play call, like his play design. And obviously we talked about the sequencing with Dave Canales and that being an issue. I like what Dave Canales said today. He said that having Brad call plays allows him to be the head coach, which means that he can now turn to special teams meetings, defensive meetings. He can control the sideline. He can ask his team what they need. And I think that's a great messaging point, but I also think it's a logical next step for Dave Canales and Brad Idzik as a partnership. We've seen that, Dave brought him over from Tampa Bay, and when he was offensive coordinator, he had Brad essentially as his passing game coordinator and his wide receivers coach. Then they moved over here. He was essentially his sounding board and play crafter while Dave would call his plays. Here's the thing, though. The thing about having an offensive coordinator in title who does all of or most of the design, leads all the offensive meetings, that's terrific, but then it gets handed over to somebody else who also has to manage a game. And there's no natural connective tissue there beyond what you've gone over throughout the offseason or throughout the week or the general playbook. So when the bullets are flying, so to speak, everything can change. It's one of those things where everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth, and the Panthers got punched in the mouth pretty regularly on offense over the last 2 years. Dave Canales was very self-deprecating and said, he had some lowlights over the last 3 years. The Panthers have finished in the bottom, I believe it's 6 in yardage and points in each of the past 2 years. It was time. I had mentioned it after the San Francisco game that this infrastructure, no matter what happened, needed to change. It was a pretty polarizing tweet, got a lot of feedback. They did the right thing here. They didn't put their heads in the sand after making the playoffs. They could clearly see something was up. And look, I think this is absolutely the right move, especially because Darrell Bevell can back up and provide a sounding board for Brad Idzik. But most importantly, I'm correct. And I just had some really great hummus. What do you think about the move, Alex?
Well, I wanted to talk about this a little bit. So I wasn't necessarily surprised because I read your work and I'm listening to you while you're logically explaining why, okay, Darrell Bevell coming in can kind of pave the way for Brad Idzik to get this really important experience as a play caller. I totally understood that. And I also saw how Dave Canales struggled to manage the game while also being the play caller, while also being the quarterback's coach and all these things. We saw it it was no more apparent than in week 17 in a win and you're in a playoff game for the first time since 2017 when the Panthers just there were several broken several strange officiating calls, and Dave wasn't able to really contest them. He wasn't really able to get an explanation from the referees because he had to go back and be in Bryce Young's ear and immediately move on from the play. I mean, not to make too big of a deal about this, but that play where Bryce threw the ball to Rico Dowdle, and it ended up being a lateral, and they ended up losing 10 yards. And instead of it being a 2nd and 10, it was like a 2nd and 20, and that derailed the drive, a really important drive, blah, blah, blah. Like, a head coach would be able to figure out how to manage that situation when he doesn't have all these other responsibilities on top of him. I'm not saying that everything changed in week 17. There were several other moments where I think at least on game day, the fact that Dave was also the play caller kind of hindered him a little bit. But that's the one that keeps sticking in my mind. So I'm not necessarily surprised, but when I just like layer in all this logic, but I am still surprised a little bit because Dave loves calling plays. This is kind of where he's built his identity a little bit. And I was really kind of refreshed to hear not only Dave himself admitting, hey, this is the sort of move that requires me putting my ego to the side, but even Brad Idzik acknowledged it, saying, hey, I know how big of an opportunity this is because I was in that headset and I knew how much Dave loved calling plays, sequencing plays, watching this offense come to life. And I'm curious about you. I mean, like, you are sounding like you weren't surprised by it. But is there any part of you that's just like, wow, Dave actually did it? Dave actually made this decision to do this in 2026?
Not really, because I think that Dave is very self-aware, like hyper self-aware. Like sometimes you don't necessarily get that out of a press conference or what have you, but I think he's a guy that kind of knows what's going on and he can read the tea leaves. And I think he has people in his ear in a good way, in a positive way.
Yeah,
and I've seen Brad Idzik kind of take steps as a play caller subtly on film. Guys are getting open. I think Bryce trusts him. I think the wide receivers trust him. I also think when you have a guy who's a former wide receivers coach and a former college wide receiver, and you see the production that Tetairoa McMillan had this year, it only furthers the investment and furthers the confidence. I also think Darrell Bevell's a huge hire, like a huge hire. And, you know, his experiences, they ran a lot of wide zone in Miami that can then be partnered with some concepts that they have, some mid zone and outside zone stuff. And I think this is going to be an interesting offense. It's not going to look the same as it did the last couple of years because it'll be somebody sequencing the plays who is not Dave Canales. And what I really respect about what Dave said was he needed to do what was best for the team. There was a rather asinine, I don't remember what the outlet was, but it was a major outlet that said that Dave was like one of like the 5 guys on like with the hottest seat, which I find absolutely ridiculous.
I do remember that. Yep.
This move only furthers that point. I actually said something to somebody earlier today. I'm like, this only furthers his confidence because if he was that concerned, he would have kept the play calling. He wouldn't have put his buddy in harm's way. And I don't want to say that in a negative way. Brad's more than just his buddy. His grandfather was an offensive coordinator. His father was a GM and one of the best cap guys in the business. Football's in his blood, more so than even Canales. And I think Brad's got the right attitude. He is open-minded. He's smart. He loves talking ball. You can tell how much he loves the game. And I really enjoy our interactions with him. But I think you're going to enjoy the interactions even more now if you're a fan, because now there's, I don't want to say there's skin in the game, but he is in control. He is in control of the offense. It's not just his slideshow. It's not just his squiggles on a piece of paper. He is running the offense. And I think that that's the best thing for him, because at some point you got to prove yourself. But I also think it's kind of the best thing for Dave, because Dave's strengths are leadership, management, vibes, like, and that's okay. We've seen that with Nick Sirianni. As much flack as he gets on the outside, he's made the playoffs every year that he's been a head coach and been to 2 Super Bowls and won one. I'm not saying that it's the same trajectory, but I swear to you, I remember the day that Nick turned over play calling his first year to Shane Steichen, and 2 stars were born. Nick Sirianni and Shane Steichen, who, if you remember all the way back when in 2023, that was the guy that I was adamant they should hire. And I know it's been up and down in Indianapolis, and he's had kind of a weird road. I I think Brad's got very high upside. And when they were hired here in 2024, Brad was the guy that kept coming up in my conversations with people around the league and people in coaching circles. If he takes advantage of this and they do well and he gets a head coaching job, well, great. Well, you're starting to do well. And then you also have Darrell Bevell, who's not going to be looking for a head coaching job, so you can fall back on him too. So I think they're set up really well. Before we turn the dial over to our next subject, you got to talk to Brad after Dave said that. What was your biggest takeaway from what Brad had to say?
Just that he's ready for this moment. He has been, I've always been impressed with him in interviews and his ability to kind of explain the vision of this offense. That was the superpower of Dave Canales. That's how he stood out to Pete Carroll. That's how he stood out among all these offensive coordinator candidates in Tampa Bay. And that's ultimately what made him stand out in Carolina in 2024 when he was trying to get his first head coaching job. And I see the same sort of traits in Brad Idzik. I love that Brad is quite forthcoming about his football past, about how much his father has meant to him in his football journey. He told a funny story about how he was a bye week baby. I actually got to talk to Brad's father, John Idzik Jr., a little bit, and he told me the story about how he was a bye week baby. In 1991, John Idzik Jr. was a graduate assistant for the Duke Blue Devils football program. And the way that John explained it was his wife was quite pregnant, and one Saturday was an away game. Then there was a bye week, and then the other Saturday was another bye week. So the only way he could have been there for the birth of his son was if it happened, obviously while they were in town. And he ended up being born on a Saturday during the bye week. And John it seems like a silly kind of small anecdote, but John was just like, now how can you tell me that no one was watching us and no one was watching Brad like through all this? So I didn't do a great job of explaining that well, but like clearly football is in this family's blood. Clearly they believe in that this is the right time and that all of this is kind of ordained and sort of thing. So I just thought that the storytelling heart in me thought that was cool. But the biggest thing was just Brad is wildly competent. So, we'll see what happens. Dude, we can talk about this for forever. And we will be talking about this for a long time as the Panthers kind of embark on this season because that's just what we do every week. We talk about play calling because that's the most important thing. But in this particular moment, we should probably spend some time talking about the free agents that the Panthers are going through. This is the first time that we were able to talk to general manager Dan Morgan since, not you. You actually got an exclusive with him earlier this offseason, but at least I got to talk to him since the Panthers broke for the season. Want to talk to you about four free agents: Cade Mays, Rico Dowdle. Actually, no, just two of them. Well, let's just talk about these two guys, Cade Mays and Rico Dowdle. He said some very interesting things about these two. Mike, what stood out to you about them?
Yeah, initially he said that, well, I had asked him, they have the third highest offensive line payroll in the league coming into into free agency. They have a $17.5 million question mark in Ike Ekwonu. Obviously, left guard Damian Lewis and right guard Robert Hunter paid. They signed Taylor Moton to extension last year. And Cade Mays is about to become a free agent. And I asked him, how much do you have to factor in the math there? Because they do have such a high payroll. And he said, you have to. And he said that Cade has earned the opportunity to go look for work elsewhere, the biggest contract. And I thought, this is one of those things where it was like, I don't think Cade's like definitely gone, but I think it's going to be tough to retain him. There are a lot of teams that need centers. It's a pretty shallow center market. He's played pretty well. He's also the guy that they cut a couple of years ago for a waiver wire claim, and the guy that they picked, Austin Corbett, they picked over him. And it's like, Now you got to pay up, and I don't know if they're going to be able to meet his price. Rico Dowdle, similarly, Dan said that he earned the right to go fish for a big deal. I don't know that he's going to get a deal like Javonte Williams, who got 3 years, $24 million. I think it's probably going to be something like 3 years, 16, 3 years, 17. And I don't know that the Panthers can invest in that. Dan said straight up that he thinks Chuba Hubbard can be a number one running back. He brought up his optimism about Jonathan Brooks. He brought up his optimism about Trevor Etienne. They really like Trevor Etienne despite his lack of playing time last year. And so I think Rico, I have said this from the jump, I do not think he's back. I just don't see it. Like, unless he's willing to come back for the same salary, I just don't see how they justify that price. He also waned down the stretch, so we'll see what he gets. But there were a couple of other guys that he brought up. He brought up Pat Jones,
Yep.
who is cleared from his back injury. But the guy I want to ask you about is Andy Dalton, because I straight up asked him, like, what is it? He's been talking about bringing competition and young guys at quarterback pretty much all offseason. Like, pretty forward. He's been pretty forward about it. It might be the most forthcoming thing he has talked about all offseason. And he made it sound like Andy's got to compete. They could double dip at the quarterback position between free agency and the draft, which red alert. That felt like a foreshadowing. What's your take on this whole Andy Dalton situation?
Yeah, it's mad interesting because I think Andy has been really important to Bryce Young's development. I don't think that's certainly not a hot take. In fact, that might even be a boring take, but you just watch how they interact with each other in the locker room. You watch how they are constantly talking to each other on the sidelines during games, during practices. They clearly have a really good rapport. Andy did not play well when he came in against the Buffalo Bills this past season when Bryce was dealing with an ankle injury. But still, like outside of that, he has been a pretty competent backup quarterback for him, particularly in 2024 when Dave Canales made the difficult decision to bench Bryce, and then Bryce came back stronger than ever after Andy Dalton served decently well in that stead and really gave the offense confidence. So to hear Dan say that Andy Dalton is going to have to compete for that QB2 job was interesting. I thought it was clear. I mean, Dan made it clear that Andy knows what's up. He knows, Dalton knows that he's going to have to compete for the job. And he's told the Observer before that he wants to play till he's 40. He is not quite there yet. I believe he's either 38 or 39. So he still has aspirations to play in this league, or to, at minimum, be a backup in this league. This is like a statement of fact. And so he's going to be competing hard for this job. I think it is interesting, but also I think could be an interesting moment in Bryce Young's development as a quarterback, because guess what? Like, this is kind of, I don't know if I'm reading too much into this, Mike. Maybe you can weigh in on this, but it kind of feels like a signal of, hey, Bryce is ready, and Bryce doesn't need to have a big brother anymore pointing his way and being like, okay, yo, this is what you do here. This is how you be a professional. It sounds like the Panthers are like, Bryce, this is your time. We can't just have you be a little brother anymore. We need you to be the leader of this quarterback room. Am I going too far in saying that, Mike? What do you think about that?
No, I think it's very intuitive. I think that's 100% what this is. Bryce is the adult in the room now. That's what they want. They want him to lead the charge. At some point, it's got to be all about him. Like, Derek Anderson was around for Cam Newton, but Cam was like a flashy personality, a dominant personality. Bryce is not that. And so now it's time for him to kind of step up, and you want to see what he's made of in this fourth year, this technically fourth audition year, before you sign into a long-term contract. And I kind of applaud the approach. I really like covering Andy. I think Andy's been a valuable asset not only to Bryce, but this team. And I think when you're switching up the offensive play caller, when when you have designs to be a long-term contender, you need to cut corners when you can. And that means bringing in a younger backup, developing backups, potentially getting younger behind him. I mean, we saw how stiff Andy was in the one start that he had. And all Dan Morgan's talked about is you want a quarterback who has mobility similar to Bryce Young. Darrell Bevell's kind of interesting, a guy that I think kind of makes sense for them if they're looking for that mobility and somebody who has experience with him. People aren't going to love this. Zach Wilson. He's a guy who's been a reclamation project. He's bounced around. He's probably a journeyman's journeyman, and he's probably going to continue to look for opportunities to play. I haven't really studied the backup quarterback group, but he's the type of guy that I think you could sign him for a pretty cheap deal and then still draft a quarterback and not feel bad about that type of competition while trying to maybe shop Andy Dalton. I've been asking around a little bit here. I've got some meetings set up with sources throughout the week, but I do wonder if they can find a trade partner for Andy Dalton. And I know people are going to be like, did you see the Buffalo game? Yeah, but I also think you've got teams like Minnesota, who has Josh McCown as the quarterback's coach, who has worked with Andy Dalton. You've got a team like the Jets. Frank Reich handpicked him to be the veteran mentor, and if they bring in somebody who's young, I mean, I could see Andy Dalton getting called to go to the Jets. Now, I don't think they can get anything more than probably a 2026 7th round pick or a 2027 6th round pick, because some teams are stupid and think that if this is Madden and that picks lose value year to year. That's not true. Actually, the Eagles basically won a Super Bowl because they didn't play by those rules with first round picks. But that's a whole nother story for a whole nother podcast. I think this is a very interesting inflection point for this offense. Not only are you handing play calling to young Bradley Idzik, but you're also making this Bryce Young's offense and his QB room, and I think that is the right move. He's now a playoff quarterback. You can say what you want about 8 and 9, but I think they're setting this up. The stakes are high, and everybody's got to deliver, and if not, there's going to be some changes made. But I think this was a very adult-like approach by Dave with Brad and with Dan with Andy, and good teams don't rest on their laurels. Like they constantly push forward. And I think if you're a Panthers fan, you should be intrigued, maybe not necessarily enthused, but intrigued by the way they are going about this. They are being assertive. They are being forthcoming. They are making changes. They are not putting their heads in the sand. They are being aggressive with what they're doing internally. So now you have the expectations that they might be a little bit more aggressive externally.
Mm-hmm.
The expectations are higher. There's no doubt. And with higher expectations comes sink or swim growth. And that's what they're doing right now.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely a moment of transition. This is, dude, like that last sermon that you went on kind of got me fired up for the rest of this week and then the rest of this offseason. It should be really special. Mike, do we need to do anything else prior to me getting us out of here?
Well, I think when we talk about this whole rigmarole of this Indianapolis trip, people are going to get stuck on, oh, this guy visited with this team. This guy did this. Really, this is an opportunity for this Panthers team to gel together, to bond during this trip. But also on top of that, figure out what they want to get out of this season, figure out what they want to do. And I think one thing that Dan Morgan was very honest about when I asked the first question of his press conference, what's the deal with inside linebacker? And I'm not Jerry Seinfeld, but I've seen enough linebackers to be like, hey man, what's going on? What's going on? And he said that they want to attack linebacker. And I think if they are this open about it, they will attack linebacker. I really think Devin Lloyd's the perfect guy for this group. We talked about margins last week of paying positions that are not considered premium. If you want stars, but you aren't willing to pay high prices for outside linebackers or tight ends or whatever, inside linebacker and safety are a way to do it. They did it with Trevon Merrick. I think Devin Lloyd could be this year's Merrick, and I don't think he will price out of their range. I think when you hear him talk, and they talk about these double dipping, I think we'll see 2 new inside linebackers, maybe not 2 inside linebacker starters, and 2 new outside linebackers. Probably not 2 outside linebacker starters because Nick Swarton, praise be he. But I think those are the 2 positions. If you're going to circle something in free agency to look for, inside linebacker and outside linebacker, and it's not a one-size-fits-all thing. If they go and they top the market with Devin Lloyd, and then they go to the mid-tier market and get a guy like Bradley Chubb, or they get a guy like Justin Fasai or whomever who we've mentioned on this podcast, I think they will also partner those guys up with some young guys to develop. And the name of the game in the NFL is you want to develop guys who are cost effective, but you also want to bring in star players. And I think there's a recipe for success for them this offseason.
Mike, you're breaking people's hearts who really want the Panthers to use that number 19 pick at the inside linebacker spot. Obviously, the last 2 times the Panthers have drafted inside linebackers first round, Shaq Thompson in 2015, Luke Kuechly in 2012, Pro Football Hall of Famer Luke Kuechly. That is. Great show, Mike. And here we go. Thanks, as always, for listening to our pontifications on all things Panthers with Mike Kaye and myself and our wonderful producer, Zach Dennis. Please subscribe and follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts by searching Processing Blue. And if you watch us on YouTube, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and click on the bell icon to get notified whenever new episodes drop. And finally, please be sure to stick to CharlotteObserver.com for all of your Panthers needs. Mike, stay humble, stay creative, and keep processing.
That's a wrap.